This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and it is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. And boy, howdy, we're going to be doing some of that today, checking out what's wrong in our democracy. Before we start, just remember, subscribe or follow, depending on what your app lets you do. And that rating, and especially writing the reviews, it really does help. We have this new helpful link in our show notes. It's not just, it goes to the Apple Podcast review section, but it also automatically can send you to other apps if you're, listening on other apps that allow you to write the reviews. All of this, it helps get the word out so more people can participate in these conversations like the one I am super excited to be having today with my pal, Mike Madrid.
Corey. Oh, good to be with you, brother. It's always great. Love the show. Love what you built, man. I just love from our early conversations. It's probably 3 years ago now, maybe a little longer from when we first started chatting.
Yeah, exactly. 3 years.
Thanks for your voice and what you built here. It's great to be part of it.
So we have a lot of new listeners, so I do feel obligated to give a little bit of an intro to, to the mythology of Madrid. So Mike Madrid is a veteran American political consultant, one of the country's authoritative experts on Latino voters, and a co-founder of the Lincoln Project. He's a partner in the political consulting firm Grassroots Lab and is the author of the new book, The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. And most notably, I think one of, if not the most frequent guest on TPNR.
An honor I do not take lightly. Yeah.
You and Roush are competing. Like Jonathan Roush came on about a month or two ago, and there was a really important piece that he did for The Atlantic. So that's one of the coolest things about doing this thing is that people whose work I've admired for a long time, who've been edifying for me, in my own, political journey, and just engagement with our country. I get to hang out with some of these guys like you and Roush and, Pete Wehner and Steslow and just all these really cool people. So real treat for me. And it's always great to see you again, Mike.
That's always a treat for us too. I don't think you'd be getting the audience if people weren't attracted to what you're doing. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. I love your brain, love sharing ideas, love what you've built, and let's keep going. Let's keep getting bigger and better.
Let's do it. So I definitely have so much that I want to talk to you about the book. But before we get into that, tell me about the Camino.
Yeah. I after many years, I decided earlier this year to take my Camino. The time was ready. And I think the Camino calls you, talking about the Camino de Santiago in Spain, which has a really deep, rich history going back to about the 9th century. For those who don't know, there's dozens of many medieval pathways, pilgrimages that go throughout Europe to the Spanish Cathedral of Santiago, the Cathedral of St. James in the northwestern corner of Spain. And some people, go on many months-long journeys from throughout Europe. Some people take the most popular route, which is known as the Camino Frances. It's about a 30-minute route. I did what's called the Portuguese way, which is about a 10-day journey from northern Portugal north to Santiago de Compostela. And it's something that's kind of life-altering. We had a tough walk, really tough. We had historically inclement weather. It was freezing. It was raining. It was cold. I got a stomach virus for a few days. So you can imagine hiking through different terrains in Europe just being kind of miserable. But even then, it's a beautiful, glorious experience because everybody's Camino experience and walk is different. And mine certainly was. And like a lot of people asked, and I said, it wasn't the Camino I was expecting, but it was the Camino that I absolutely needed. And I highly recommend it to anybody who's considering it or have heard about it. It's a pilgrimage. It doesn't have to be spiritual, but for a lot of people it still is. And for me it was. And, so I don't know, although that wasn't too long of an answer, but
no,
I was
really
in northern Spain for a big part of this year working on my spiritual rejuvenation. I think that's a big part of us as human beings. It's a big part of why I do what I do. And to go on a pilgrimage of just kind of walking, you hit this meditative state. It strips you down in a way that only a walking journey like that can. And that's kind of the point, is to get down to your bare essence, be there with yourself. And sometimes those tough parts of the journey and the metaphor for life, all you can do sometimes is just take another step and keep going. And
Yeah.
I highly recommend it.
So this, just out of curiosity, northwestern Spain, was that a little further west than where you might have come in contact with some of the Basque region in the Pyrenees, or did you?
This is the most popular route starts in the Pyrenees, and it traverses all through northern Spain. This is really Galicia, and this is kind of where a lot of the wayfarers, the sea wayfarers, and where a lot of the naval prowess of the Spanish was built back in the day. As the story goes, and as history goes, as there was a large Islamic Muslim influence during the 8th and 9th century, the Catholic influence was basically almost gone from the peninsula. This was one of the last strongholds. And some of the Catholic kings rallied. The troops kind of made their last stands, and ultimately, over the series of the next couple of centuries, pushed the Muslims and North Africans back out of the peninsula and reestablished Christianity on the peninsula. And with that comes a lot of lore and legend. But I mean, the route that I took was about 100 kilometers. It goes through urban centers, a lot of suburban neighborhoods and homes, and a lot of just forest and coastline.
Okay.
You get a lot of everything. And like I said, weather patterns were changing everywhere. And it was a brutal, it was Holy Week. It was the week prior to Easter. And the Spanish are still very much into Semana Santa, Holy Week.
Yeah.
Not a lot of Catholics anymore, but a lot of Catholic tradition.
Yeah.
And so every little town you go into, there were those deep processions with, men in the big pointy hats that look like the Klansman hats, and stuff that goes back to the medieval days, and with huge floats that they're carrying, and the towns go all out. They've been doing these for centuries, and every town has its own unique legacy and history, and it's just really remarkable to see.
A buddy of mine lived in Pamplona for about 8 years, and I went to visit him for extended stays a couple different times. And there's a few things about that region. I mentioned the Basque folks because we had an opportunity to have some meals with families up in the mountains, and I was thinking of those families. Sometime throughout your book, you mentioned, and forgive me if I'm not articulating it exactly the right way, but basically holding space in two very different worlds at the same time, and those worlds are political, religious, heritage, being an American and a Mexican of Mexican heritage, working for, your entire adult life in the Republican Party, while also having grown up with Latino Democrats, like all of these different, these different contingencies that you're holding together as one person, which is also symbolic of the Latino people in general, those tensions. And I think, one of the images that I was really taken by right out of the gate, I didn't know, by the way, we've known each other for a few years now. I didn't know that you were a painter, and your use of the color brown. Could you tease that out a little bit? How that, as a painter, but also the symbolic nature of what you were saying there?
Yeah. So, and thanks for all of that. I mean, all of this is tied into the conceptualization of the book, pluralism, and what that means. As Americans, more than any other people, we are a people that are not entirely at home with our Americanness and our otherness. Some of us are Jewish, some of us are Irish, some of us are African American, some of us are Latino, and they are very distinct, our cultural ethnic identities that we are asked to leave at the door, at the American door. And I go into this in the book, is this other experience is not unique to Latinos at all. but it is the most profound community where it's happening because of its size at this moment. And it's going to challenge some of those questions of American identity. And to that, Latinos, by definition, we are a blended people. Our nationality is mixed. We are a mixed race. In the 60s, 50s, 60s, the idea of la raza cósmica, the cosmic race, was kind of created by thinkers of this. We are by definition, the old world and the new world come together. We are both indigenous and we are European. That's what Latino means. And as a result, it creates this mixture. And when you paint, you learn color. You have to learn color as an essential core. And I use the idea of brown as the glue that holds together all other colors, because that's what it does. And the eye doesn't pick up brown as much as other distinct colors, in part because brown works so well. Brown is a mixture of so many other colors that it allows the other colors to take their place while supporting them, but also holding the whole painting together. And so to me, that metaphor works really well, not just for painting and for optics, but socially. That's kind of what I see happening as the United States becomes a more blended race, or more blended people, not a blended race, but a blended people. And we're hitting this point in American history where, in 8 years, Corey, we will be a non-white European majority nation for the first time in our history, which is an extraordinary moment about what that means for America, how America perceives itself. Even, the conceptualization of going west, young man, right, is seeing frontier out in the West and seeing the future is West. Now, you have a people that come from the West and are looking to the East and looking north for that future. That changes frontier. It changes conceptualizations of American perspectives. And it's just at every level, it's a very profound shift. And one thing that is really important that I think is going to be unique in this new era of Americanness, this new century, this Latino century, if I call it, is that the blended characteristics of Latinos, both culturally and physically, are actually going to become a healing point for a country that has never had a healthy capacity to discuss racial differences because of our original sin. And those differences become both less important and more important at the same time. And what does that mean for democracy, right? For a society that is trying to allow for some basic concepts that we have come to take for granted: one person, one vote, a republic of people who decide for us. We decide who's going to decide for us through a representative system of government. Our cultural notions of rugged individualism and self-reliance, the apex of America being the apex of American, of Western thought, right? The United States of America, this elegant structure of government, is really the apex of Western Protestantism. That if I can find my own way to God, I certainly can find my own way to govern myself. And the United States of America is the first country to make that bold proclamation. And it builds an identity and a structure and a society with that in mind. And now it's going to be a non-majority country of cultures and people who didn't come from that tradition.
Right.
And don't come from that cultural mindset. And I don't think it's a threat at all. I think it's actually the only thing that can say this at this point in time.
Before we move on, I wanted to tell you about something else that's important. Money. Specifically your money. In all seriousness, I wanted to tell you about my advisor and my friend, George Meza. George runs Meza Wealth Management. And with George, it's not just about money. It's about helping us manage our present and plan for our future. And unlike a lot of other firms out there, George and I actually have a relationship. He knows me, he knows my family, and I know his wonderful family. I also know his firm and the incredible team he's put together, from his chief investment officer to some of the other great people in his office, like Jessica, their head of operations, that are always there to help me and with all aspects of our portfolio. You see, the thing is, I got a lot going on. I guess we all got a lot going on, and I don't have the time to watch our investments all day, every day. And even if I did, I don't have the experience and expertise that George's team collectively has. So we get the entire Mesa Wealth Management team, all their expertise and all their integrity. And again, it's based on George knowing me personally, knowing my goals, and even the kind of risk that's appropriate for me to take, which, by the way, could change from one season to the next. And they're on top of all of that. So if you want George Mesa and Mesa Wealth Management to be on your team, just visit their website, mesawealth.com. That's MEZA wealth.com, www.mesawealth.com. And that will also be in our show notes, so you can check that. And now, back to our show. So one of the startling stats that you shared, that you dug into a little bit later in the book, it really caught my attention, was comparing baby boomers to Gen Z. 79% of baby boomers identify as white, and baby boomers being roughly between 47 and maybe 63, 64. Whereas Gen Z, or my kids, and probably your kids too, between, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, 97 and about 2010, 2011 or so.
Right.
So 79% of baby boomers identify as white. Only 52% of Gen Z identifies as white. And then one of the, so think about that. So first of all, before I get into, I want to talk about pluralism versus tribalism, because you touched upon that already, but let's just sit on that for a second. 79 versus 52%. What implications does that kind of contrast have in terms of the future of our country, of our politics?
It's an extraordinarily fast shift. It's not that just that it's happening; it's that it's happened within one or two generations, and that, I think, is when you understand that change in perspective, that change in our mythology of America and what e pluribus unum means, and this idea that anybody who comes to America can be an American and we're unique that way. All of it, we're really challenging these basic American beliefs about ourselves, and we're finding that they're not true. We don't really believe a lot of this stuff. We've said it for 250 years, but it's easy to say things. It's easy to have a national mythology when it's never challenged. And so the idea of America being kind of a melting pot and anybody can kind of come here if you just leave the hyphen at the door, we know that was never true. I mean, African Americans have never had a seat at the table, most distinctly. We know that different people, different non-white people have never had an equal standing at the table. We can disagree as to what degree or not, but it's just, anybody who dismisses that, it just lacks a basic core understanding of American society. And so what that means is, and this is one of the really funny things about politics, Corey, that I really love, is even when you're right about the data, because we're human beings, you're usually not right for the right reasons. So let me give you an example. We've always talked about Gen Z sort of being the first generation of Americans that won't see color as an issue because they're so multicultural, they're so diverse. It's the first truly diverse generation of Americans, racially and ethnically. But notice what's happening politically is young people, Latinos and African Americans, are shifting to the right faster than any other age cohort or group, when so much of the language of the right is racially and ethnically charged. So how can that be happening? And the answer is mainly because they don't see color. It doesn't occur to them the way that they're not as sensitive to it as you and I are, because they're looking for those economic messages first and foremost. They're not as sensitive to they're not, and I would argue even maybe it's fair to say overly sensitive to some of the politically driven terminology that is defining our current era. It's not that they're dismissive of it. It's that they don't have the same historical understanding, sensitivity, or legacy of it. So it's not as impactful to them. It's easily dismissed or overlooked or considered as a secondary, tertiary consideration. Does that make sense?
It does. So assimilation is a bigger factor than racial identity. Is that fair to say, or am I kind of mixing some things?
No, that's the thesis. So that's why I smile. You're sharp, dude. That's basic. That's anybody who wants to understand what's happening with Latino voters needs to understand that question, and the answer is yes. So let me rephrase it a little bit. The Latino voter is rapidly becoming and emerging, not realigning, but emerging as an economic and class voter, where their parents and grandparents were a racial and ethnic voter. Mm. That's what the assimilation process largely does. And I don't want to dismiss what's happening as something that happened 100 years ago at Ellis Island. It is foundationally and fundamentally different. It is much more of a hybrid for a lot of reasons we can discuss. But essentially, when you look at the data, the fastest growing segment of the Latino community, and it's exploding, are third generation, fourth generation is now measurable Latinos, primarily Americans. And they're much more driven by class considerations than they are stereotypical issues related to race and ethnicity, like immigration, for example, or affirmative action. These are not salient issues. And yet both parties are so stuck in the trenches on the way they want to approach a racial and ethnic minority that no longer sees itself as one. And that in a nutshell explains the disconnect between both major parties and the fastest growing segment of the electorate.
That makes a lot of sense. So Democrats are appealing to what you would think of as first generation Latino Americans, Latinx, if you will, or appealing to these things that sound like they're appealing to the racial and ethnic part of it, an aggrieved minority, if you will. Whereas what you just said, the largest, the fastest growing part of the population are third generation, second and third and fourth generation folks, right. Like yourself. You're a third generation. Right. Republicans have basically messages of malice, toward what the Democrats are, socialism and, communists and new communists and Marxists are trying to do to us, this nativist, protectivist, whereas neither part. Meanwhile, as you say, Latinos are coming up the middle, and neither party is really appealing to this quickly growing part of the population. I have lots of questions about that, but I really want to get back to your origin story, your family's origin story. But while we're on it, what would an economic working class agenda look like?
It would start with housing. It may even end with housing. It's that important. Let me give you an example. And I mentioned this in the book, because people always go, well, that Mike, you're so good at pointing out the problem. What's the solution? Well, I'll tell you really quickly. 1 in 5 Hispanic men in this country are employed in the residential construction space or related fields. 1 in 5. Yeah. That is an extraordinary number, right? That's like literally the entire Latino economy. And it's not just the guys swinging hammers. It's mortgage brokers. Yeah. It's realtors. And when interest rates triple and housing comes to basically a complete stop, or whether it's non-existent, like in California, you see a very direct, meaningful, painful economic impact on these households. And so when you start to ask the question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? That's not a difficult question to ask economically for most Latino households. They were far better off 4 years ago economically, because they were working. First of all, they were working, and second of all, they were working in a field and an industry that suited their needs, both professionally, the professional class, and sort of the blue-collar working class. You add on to it that Latinos are the fastest growing segment of the blue-collar workforce in things like the energy space, manufacturing space, agriculture, mining, fishing. All of these blue-collar industries view the Democratic Party as an existential threat to their livelihoods. We can debate and discuss to what degree, but they're here for economic reasons. They've been saying for 30 years the top issue is economic issues. They're also at the lower rung of the economic ladder. So when our currency is devalued by 20% over the past 3.5 years, and that is not blaming anybody, I'm just saying as a matter of fact and evidence, they are disproportionately impacted. So it's not at all a stretch to say life was better 3 or 4 years ago, regardless of the fact that I've got people in a party in power that don't like me, don't hate me, don't want me here. I get it. But if you've ever lived hand to mouth, this is not a difficult consideration at all. At all. I mean, that's the basics of feeding your kids and putting a roof over their heads at night. And that's kind of one of the things that I think explains this economic shift, this shift towards an economic perspective with Latino voters, because the Democrats' response is, well, they're trying to put kids in cages and separate families and deport you all, and all that's true. But again, that doesn't take away the immediacy and the impact of their ability to provide for their family. One, but two, a lot of Latinos rightfully think we need more border security. It's not racist to want border security. In fact, it's a requirement of a organized government. That's one of the first responsibilities. And I think as Democrats consolidate white, wealthier, college-educated voters, they bring their own perspective on the way Latinos should be thinking. And there's a certain luxury of thinking about the issues that should be animating this voting bloc the further you get away from, a subsistence or barely better life.
Yeah.
And that's what Latinos are saying is we want more economic opportunity. We may or may not like the border policies, but that's a fifth, sixth, seventh, priority list behind the by far the most important, which is economics.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as mentioned, I was absolutely fascinated with your own family story. The way that your grandfather and grandmother got married. Could you tell us a little bit more about the circumstances that, how your grandparents met and what brought them to the U.S.?
Yeah, this is on my mother's side. Now, my parents.
By the way, I'm learning a little bit about your mom. I absolutely love Rosa. Is that how you say it? Rosalina?
Rosalina, yeah.
I love her.
You'll meet her at some time. I mean, she lives and see me. I mean, you guys are neighbors.
That'd be great.
And it's the story of Ventura County too, right? So, I mean, truly, my family moved in 1971. My family moved to literally the end of the freeway. The freeway used to stop by where Moorpark College is. It didn't connect with that big bridge loop when I was growing up. But my grandparents on my mother's side are from Sonora and Durango, which are two northern Mexican states. They're desert states. My grandfather was in his early 30s, and he had been working in the World War II economy. He was a mechanic, and he was working on the sprawling industrial economy there that was desperately needing workers and laborers. And he came as a young man, and he would cross frequently into Texas or into California. His sisters came and settled in Los Angeles, and he returned to the homeland, probably in part to find a wife. And he met Leonidas Ballesteros, my maternal grandmother. She was 15 at the time. He was about 32. She was Yaqui Indian, essentially functionally illiterate, lived out in the desert, in the sticks. And within a few months, they had married, and he was going to bring her to, Los Angeles, which, the overwhelming culture and economic shock of somebody who didn't speak the language or read and write in any language, coming from a very, very, rural community to Los Angeles in the 40s, just had to be overwhelming. And she, raises a family with 6 children. And that's the immigrant story that lasts for all of us. And certainly a big part of my family's narrative and my sensitivities and the issues that I've worked on and protecting the least among us and the immigrant. That's my grandmother. And they came to the urban core of LA and raised kids in deep poverty in LA.
Yeah.
And so that was my grandparents, and then my parents, they didn't go to college. My father, joined the Army, the Navy rather, to go serve in Vietnam overseas, served on the same ship with John Kerry. My mother started having kids, essentially right out of high school. And, back then you could kind of get a job without a college degree. And my dad did at a bank. And that was enough to buy a home out in the middle of nowhere, which was Moorpark, California, population 2,500 in 1971. And that's where they moved us.
Wow. There was something else you pointed out too, the historical context. You said my childhood hometown and state once had been land owned by wealthy citizens of Spain and Mexico until it was all legally stolen by the U.S. Congress. So when I think about, Trump's words and his rhetoric, especially like right as soon as he came down that escalator, how cruel and ironic it all is, when the truth is, in a way, Mexican immigrants are actually just coming back home. So that I try to explain that in the book, which is my parents were never of the opinion, neither were my grandparents, who were very loyal American, very patriotic Americans. My grandmother, I remember when she naturalized and became a citizen, it was the proudest moment of her life. And she was an American. She was not Mexican at that point. And there was no dual citizenship, or she left Mexico to become an American. And my parents were never anything but 100% loyal to this country. And we were raised that way. But when you grow up in communities like Santa Clarita and Los Angeles and California and Santa Monica, and the whole state was Spanish. The whole history not that long ago was, this was Mexican territory. Before that, it was Spanish territory. And that legacy I write in the book, it didn't feel like we were coming to a foreign land as much as it was a homecoming. But that homecoming was very much about being an American. It wasn't about reconquest or reclaiming a land that was taken from us. There's this weird American insecurity about that fear. Maybe it's because of guilt of what's happened in the past. I don't know. But to me, it's completely reconcilable that you can be 100% proud of your ethnic and cultural heritage, even though it's distinct from the ancestors that came from the Mayflower, where there's no connection, and be both 100% American. There was a great interview I did with a young man, and I think it's very common with Gen Zers. They call themselves 200 percenters. It was a term I hadn't heard before. I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, I'm 100% Mexican and 100% American. I am completely both. And I thought it's such a beautiful encapsulation of saying it. For me, in my generation, when there were less Latinos growing up, it was more of a struggle of navigating your way through a white world while maintaining that, with your home and close family. That's not the way this generation's growing up anymore. They don't believe there's any disloyalty by having to choose. They fully embrace both, and I think it's lovely. Yeah, it's definitely a part of your story that resonates with me. Obviously, they're different stories and different family histories, but you, as growing up in an observant Jewish family, you always identify as part of a long line of Jews, thousands and thousands of years. Even on my bar mitzvah invitation, it said, as my father and grandfather before me, or just a month ago when we had the Seder for Passover, we're talking about what God did for us. The Exodus story retold in the first person plural. That was another part of what really resonated with me, is that, to add flavor to this American story, this larger American story, there is indeed that rugged individualism. But in your community, as in my community and my family, it's almost meaningless if it's devoid of community and family, who you are within the context of community and family.
And I think that the story of the Jewish people it's not a small example of this. I think it's the global example of this, in large part because it's a diaspora that through most of its written history has not had a home.
Yeah.
Right. And so community takes on an extraordinarily important component of Judaism, of being a Jew. It's not about you, and it's not just about your family and the community. It's about thousands of years of common struggle and uniting in this way. And the bonds of culture and ethnicity in Judaism are extraordinarily strong, perhaps as strong as any group in the world for that reason. And so otherness and being in both worlds is something that I think the Jewish people understand probably more than any other people, and not just in the American context, in the global context, basically anywhere.
Yeah.
And so it's a great reference point when you study identity and ethnicity and culture and race. Invariably, if you're not looking at the Jewish people, you're missing a huge part of the whole story.
No, I appreciate that. And as fraught as some of these conversations are, with the war in Israel, with what's happening in Gaza, as well as the protests that are happening around the country. In fact, one of my kids has been participating in some of those protests up way up, even further north than you, up in Humboldt. But I think that these differences, these stark differences, ideally should create opportunities for conversations. As hard as they are, we should be able to have these difficult conversations across our differences. But unfortunately, it seems like a lot of the dialogue and a lot of the narrative has been hijacked by some of the worst examples, a lot of the folks who don't necessarily come in good faith. But maybe that's for another podcast that I should have you back on.
Yeah.
I did want to talk about your political journey a little bit. One of your early experiences that was almost like a precursor, is like a teaser for what was to come, is when you served on Pete Wilson's board of governors of the community college system. You described it as one of the first times, if not the first time, that you were confronted by white progressives who wanted to tell you what was best for people, for you and people like you. And am I wrong? But that's a tendency that seems to persist, doesn't it?
Yeah, on steroids now. But that was the first time I experienced it, but I've experienced it throughout my life. And it's not, I guess there have been times where I've been deeply offended by it. But, look, you know me, I'm a little bit controversial in that I think in many ways, white progressives are more as much or more of a threat to the Latino community as white conservatives. Because with white conservatives, you know what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
White progressives tend to have far more influence in our government, in the media, in the narratives that we tell ourselves. And as somebody who's worked in the policy space, when I look at things like housing policy and housing restrictions and where we put affordable housing and where we don't put affordable housing, which is central to wealth building and wealth creation and aspirational views of the middle class, it's not white conservatives that are restricting that. It's not white conservatives that are protecting a public education system that is failing our kids. It's not, and I'm not. The book is not an argument. It's not an argument for conservatism, or it's not for republicanism. Certainly, it may make some positive arguments about conservatism, but it's absolutely not an argument for republicanism. In fact, my life and my career, especially recently, I think is a testament to that. Rather, it's a rebuke of both, and saying there needs to be some self-reflection here. And I tried to do it elegantly enough so that it's not like one of those books that's like, we need a third party or a third way. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that Latinos are the moderates in both parties. Latino voters are. We know that quantifiably. And that gives us it gives the Democrats the opportunity to focus on the working class, get back to its FDR working class roots. And it allows Republicans to get back to its Lincoln-esque roots of saying that the promise of America is essentially and fundamentally a question of racial pluralism.
Right.
And if both parties would get back to those roots, we would be in a much better place as a country. But both parties have drifted so far from their aspirations and in many ways their origin stories that they're really not recognizable anymore. And what we're doing in this country is we're really having a fight between older Gen Xers and boomers who are throwing cultural tantrums about the direction of the country, essentially tearing our institutions apart, willing to overthrow the government if you don't like the election outcome. While right behind them is this Gen Y, Gen Z, millennial, diverse group of people, younger, poorer, and browner, saying, we believe in America. We believe in the institutions. Even though it hasn't served us particularly well, there's the hope and the aspiration and the promise that it can if it's only done better. And that defines the moment. Is the divisions in America are about the college educated and the non-college educated. They are about the haves and the have-nots, but they are also very much about the generational differences and the racial differences that divide us. That stat you pointed out earlier in this talk was 79% of boomers identify as white. Just barely over half of Gen Zers do. That matters. That's changing. And that racial discourse has been so dysfunctional for so long that I believe that we're seeing in many ways is sort of the last pangs, death throes of that type of thinking in American identity. And what is emerging is something far more inclusive and tolerant and truer to the American creed.
It seems like such a missed opportunity. And I think you might make the case that this moment, this Trump era, is more of an anomaly, because if you look at Reagan and Bush 1 and certainly Bush 2, there was more of an optimism that was expressed compared to that very first message when Trump's announcement speech back in spring of 2015. Would you mind just so that we can get some context here to contrast Trump and Trumpism's rhetoric with that of the rhetoric of a Reagan, which brought you into the Republican Party in the first place as a young man?
Yeah, I mean, part of this is going to have to, part of this is going to have to require an understanding of conservatism. And I'll be brief here, but, conservatism is the idea that we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, all of us, that it's not a blood and soil question. And I'm not going to suggest that in my journey through Republicanism, beginning in the mid-late 80s, that there weren't always these discussions of nativism and America Firstism and racism happening in Republican conventions and with Republican activists. They absolutely 100% were. But they were this weird, particular, marginal, community that were ostracized by the leadership. That was not tolerated. Reagan spoke out against it. William Buckley drove the John Birchers out of the Republican Party to create the modern movement. Bob Dole, George Bush, all of these people renounced the David Dukes. They renounced that element of the party, as it were, and it was just not acceptable.
By the way, it should be noted, I was thinking of that moment in the early to mid 60s when William F. Buckley basically mitigated the influence of the Birchers. That was at great cost. It wasn't like it was easy and obvious. It was daring, especially given his trajectory up to that point, as well as Reagan, to say, no, I don't want the endorsement of a neo-Nazi, of a Klan leader. That came at great cost and political risk. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm
glad you did.
We've talked about this quite a bit, but it should be noted that, Trump has taken over the Republican Party. And, unlike folks like you and Steslow and others who've basically risked their entire careers, there's such a lack of courage. There's such a lack of integrity because, we just have to go with the flow and play for the home team. So it wasn't like this is a new thing and others didn't take those risks and pay that price in the past. Anyway, I apologize for interrupting, but I really want to underscore that point that you're making.
I appreciate that. I'm glad that you did. I mean, that's kind of what we're doing here is just a discussion. So, in that moment, required that because the idea of conservatism as defined by the Buckleys and the Reagans was universal. It only works when it is open to everybody. That is the point. If it's not open to everybody, it is not conservatism. It's populism and nationalism. And that's not just a semantic difference. It's a profoundly different view and philosophical imagination of the world. And that has always been one of the things that I have disliked about the Republican Party is agreeing with people, even though I vehemently opposed the reasons why we agreed on policy, right? Let me get affirmative action. I opposed affirmative action because I wanted to have a truly colorless society that focused and promoted on elevating non-white people to a place where they could compete. I would be voting the same way as people who just didn't like black and brown people and didn't want them, right? It's the same objective, but the way you get there is completely different. And that's what populism is. That's what nationalism is. That, in a nutshell, is what isolationism is. And they're all three very dangerous, abhorrent, toxic ideologies. And they are the majority of the Republican Party at this moment in time. And it's not a small minority. I think it's an overwhelming majority. And that raises a whole other, cadre or spectrum of questions. But to your point, conservatism allowed for these happy warriors. Ronald Reagan's optimism was infectious. It was confident. It was the sign of an abundant nation that viewed itself as stronger than others because it did not need to hide or fear or build walls. And the same, I think, could be said with George W. Bush. This now comes down to Trumpism, which is inherently fearful. It's hateful and it's angry and it's cowardly and it's frightened, and it speaks to the frightened nature of people who are fearful of change, and they build walls to protect themselves. And I mentioned this, and I've been invited to speak at the Reagan Library in October. I'm going to have you there with me when I do to speak on the book. The shining city on a hill speech is an immigration speech. The Republicans always stop. When Reagan talked about the shining city on the hill, windswept and God blessed is where they stop. The next sentence says, if there has to be a wall, it has to have doors. A large opening, that is doors that will open to all, and all that want to come. That's universality. That's saying this only works. The reason we're a shining city on the hill is because we have an open door. That's what makes it exceptional.
Right.
Is that it is an opening to everybody. That's the Republican Party I joined. The Republican Party of today is 180 degrees different than that.
Right.
It is a fearful, old, aging, cowardly mob that feels that America has been lost. None of that is conservatism.
So I want to apply some analysis and maybe derive some prescriptions like you do so well in the book. I love some of the stories that you share about some of the characters you've come across along the way, one of whom you referred to as a Hall of Fame ad man, Lionel Sosa. You worked on the George W. Bush campaign. It sounds like you learned a ton from him. One of the fascinating takeaways is what he said about earning Latino votes, which is about tying Republican conservative values to conservative Latino values. So I'm guessing that still, you would say that still holds true today.
I would, and the reason why I say that, and so the question is a really important one, because a lot of people are saying, well, that's great, Mike, but why if you're so right about that, why is Donald Trump getting more?
That was my next question. Yeah.
Right. So let me walk you through all of it. First, when I met Lionel, we were winning, upwards of 40+% share of the Latino vote when I was doing the George W. Bush campaign with him in 2004. We hit 37, and then we hit, like 44, and then reelect. And you have to understand something, and this is a very big part of the book, and it's a very big part of the moment that people need to understand. The Latino electorate in 2000 and 2004 was dramatically more foreign-born than it is today. And that's important because foreign-born Latinos historically vote 75, sometimes 80% with the Democrats. And they always have. It's that assimilation that takes place over the generation, rising incomes, rising intermarriage rates, blending, more comfort being an American, less affinity for the homeland. All of this stuff sees a gradual transition towards republicanism historically. Donald Trump, I would argue, if you look at, so if that is true, and we got such a huge share by being optimistic and being inclusive and showing how Latinos were Americans and had a seat at the table, which we did, and it worked. Why is Trump doing the opposite, nearing the same levels we were getting? And the answer, I would argue, is this. If you look at governors like Ron DeSantis in Florida, Greg Abbott in Texas, Doug Ducey in Arizona, and even the Republican nominee against Gavin Newsom, Brian Dahle, guy that nobody knew, they all have one thing in common. They did better with Latino voters than Donald Trump did. Every one of them. And if you look at every congressional district in California that is marginal, including Mike Garcia's, John Duarte's, David Valadao's, they all outperformed Donald Trump in Hispanic dense precincts. What does all that data tell us? It tells us that without Donald Trump, the Republican Party would be in the mid-40s already naturally. Donald Trump is slowing the trend to the right. He's not accelerating it, and he's not bringing it. He's limiting it. And that's happening because of economic and assimilative reasons. It's not happening because of the racial or ethnic verbiage that you're hearing coming from his dirty little mouth. It's happening, and I say this explicitly in the book. Republicans are winning a greater share of the Latino vote despite their best efforts, not because of it. And that's what I'm saying, is if the Democrats could just get back to some working class issues, they would be back in their historical range of getting 75% of the Hispanic vote, certainly 70%. They wouldn't be sitting at 60 or 65, which seriously puts Biden's reelection in jeopardy, as well as control of the House of Representatives.
Okay, so since you bring it up, you said something really interesting a couple of weeks ago on the roundtable on politicology. And I just, while we're talking about it, broader context, you said that you were saying that we're seeing Biden's weaknesses in the polls, but not on the ground, yet we're seeing Trump's weaknesses on the ground, but not in the polls. So can you tease that out for us?
Yeah. I thought that was particularly astute observation that kind of encapsulated a lot of things I've been saying for a while, because I am saying some things that people going, you're nuts, and maybe I am, but this is the way I look at the race. The fundamentals of this race strongly lead towards a Biden reelection. They overwhelmingly. Now, is he going to win? I don't know. If I were betting, I would bet on Biden. But that doesn't mean, and we've got a long way to go. A lot of things are going to happen, and a lot of crazy is going to happen. So, take that with a grain of salt. But what I will say is this: Biden's polling continues to show weakness, particularly with three demographics: young people, African-American men specifically, and U.S.-born Hispanic men specifically. They just don't like the guy. But come election day, he's winning precincts by what we call Assad level numbers, like 90% plus, like ridiculous numbers. All of those polling disparities go away. Donald Trump is showing, and he's polling, a consolidation of the Republican base at 94, 95%. Yet, even now, with Nikki Haley dropping out 5, 6, 8 weeks ago, she's getting 20%, 22% of the vote.
Yeah.
So what's happening, right? Well, the answer is the way, and again, a lot of this is, I think, a little bit in the weeds, but the way the pollsters are weighting college-educated voters and non-college educated voters isn't reflecting the single largest shift in the electorate, which is the education divide. And white college-educated Republicans, if you look at where Donald Trump is losing Republican voters, it's in the suburbs. He's losing college-educated people really quickly, white people who've just had it, and they're moving to the Democratic Party, which in large part is why the Democrats are winning all of these special elections and the midterms and all these low turnout elections. And this is an important point too for close political observers. It's not just that Democrats are doing so well. You keep hearing Dobbs, and abortion. There is some truth to that. But this started well before Dobbs, started in at least 2016. And what it's a function of is more engaged, high information, higher educated voters are moving to the Democrats. You know what? Those are three strong correlate characteristics to high voting propensity. These people show up and vote. So the more educated the Democratic Party becomes, the better it's going to do in low turnout elections. It used to be the opposite. That defies all conventional wisdom from people your age and my age that grew up saying, oh, low turnout elections help the Republicans. No, in fact, if you look at the high turnout elections like 2020, Donald Trump loses, but something happens that year that hasn't happened in 50 years, which was the Republicans picked up seats in the House the same year they lost the presidency. What that tells us is Donald Trump was turning off too many of his Republican base, but Republicans were showing up in disproportionate numbers because they're low information, non-college educated voters. And so now what we're going to see is high turnout elections start to benefit Republicans and low turnout elections start to benefit the Democrats. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. But
okay,
that said,
I don't know if that's too. Yeah.
No, totally not. Because I don't care if it, I don't know how many people are as interested in this as I am, but I'm super geeky interested in it.
Yeah.
But it contrasts something else that you said. And here's where the opportunity is that the part of the missed opportunity is that the Latino voters, they're just not voting. And it's not a matter, I think, if I remember correctly, it's not a matter of apathy. It's that neither party is giving them a message that they can really get passionate about, the way that you describe your response to Reagan's messaging in the mid to late 80s.
100%. So Latinos are the fastest growing segment of the electorate. We just surpassed African Americans as the largest ethnic minority in the country, the largest voting bloc behind white voters. And yet we've got the lowest voter turnout and participation rates of any of the four major race or ethnic groups. And this is not new. This has been a characteristic that goes back to at least the mid-1990s. Some would suggest mid-1980s. And what I'm arguing is that when you've got one party that focuses almost exclusively on the racial and ethnic immigration-related issues or farm worker issues or undocumented issues, that are speaking to a very small segment of the community, it becomes too unrelatable as a party and a message to actually motivate voters to show that there's a home there. The other party is dominated by actually the reverse, which is being unwelcoming, anti-immigrant, anti-Latino. And for the moment, that's the noise within which Latinos are trying to make a determination on who to vote for. And it's not playing out well for either party. It's manifesting in low turnout and disengagement. Latinos have the lowest partisan ties of any of those same four racial or ethnic groups. They just don't like either party, and it makes perfect sense when you understand it as the Republican and Democratic parties are playing to the stereotypes of what they think Latinos should be, not where Latinos actually are. And there aren't any Latino voices in the community defining this and stating this and cherry picking between the parties, because you can't in American politics. If you're not 99% with the Democrats or 99% with the Republicans, each party will consider you a traitor. So it's not even a matter of being in the middle.
Yeah.
It's a matter of arguing for a community that is emerging as something unique. A lot of people say we're in the midst of this racial realignment. I don't believe that, because most of these voters are new. They were never aligned to be realigned. It's coming up very, very rapidly. The numbers are exploding now. 18-year-olds registering to vote that are Latino. And what they're saying is, I can't relate to the Democratic Party because they're talking in a way that I don't talk about.
Yeah.
And the Republican Party is just kind of a bunch of haters. And I guess I can kind of sort of default to them, because if both of these people are unrelatable or dislikable, then I'm going to go with the group that, at least on some policies reflect where my job's at and what's going to help open up the economy in a way that works for me.
Yeah. So you mentioned one fairly recent candidate, even though he lost that race, it sounds like his messaging was headed on the right track. And that was Antonio Villaraigosa's run after he was mayor. You were, as you called it, a political odd couple. But his messaging was getting on the right track. And one current candidate, Senate candidate in Arizona, Ruben do I have that right?
Gallego.
Yeah. Gallego. So I was thinking, even though Villaraigosa lost in his bid for governor, the deck was stacked against him because there was a plethora of Democratic candidates, and the way that the races, the way the races work in California is the top two vote getters. So it's inevitably going to be Newsom, and the Republican who consolidated all of the Republican votes. But the messaging was right on the money. It got me thinking, man, if we had an Antonio Villaraigosa running in California 27, that dude would win. So,
you might. He may run again.
Oh man, let's get him to move to Stevenson Ranch and have him run here. But what was it about that campaign, and now what you're seeing in Ruben Gallego's campaign? What do they have right?
Both of them are unique in that they began their careers as very progressive members. Antonio was very progressive when he became the Speaker of the State Assembly in California when I was a kid. When I first got to know him, I talk about this in the book. He was for gay rights. He was for automatic weapons bans. He was for these things that back in the early mid 90s made you kind of a radical lefty freak. Like people were scared. Like, what is this guy going to do? And now those issues are all mainstream. And in fact, Gavin Newsom kind of, Antonio was kind of the moderate in the race. He wasn't he was the moderate. And Gavin Newsom kind of occupied the far left. What was a little bit heartbreaking for me, even somebody who's been in this business too long to get my heart broken, because I should be too cynical for that now. Well, I genuinely believe, and this was the first time I worked for a Democrat. One of the reasons I was asked to write the book is I've done political campaigns for Republicans at some of the highest levels, and I've worked with Democrats on campaigns for some of the highest levels. There's only, you can count on one hand how many consultants have done that in this country. That's just not allowed. And that gave me the opportunity to offer my perspective. And what I came to realize was, and I will say this till the cows come home, white progressives, particularly wealthy white progressives, which there's a correlation, do not care much for racial economic justice. They care and are animated by cultural issues. This is the group that cares about climate change, gun control, marriage equality. All they cared about in that primary was who was the most anti-Trump. Well, they're all Democrats. They're all going to be very anti-Trump. But only one candidate was saying the way we really beat Trumpism is by lifting people out of poverty. It's by lifting the working class up and giving them an upwardly aspirational agenda. And because I think Antonio lost, there has been no focus on poor and working class Latinos in California. And we've got the worst income inequality divide in the entire country by a wide measure. And so what's happening now, all of these voters, these Latino voters, are leaving the Democratic Party. They're voting for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And it's because there's no agenda in the Democratic Party. And I'm sure a lot of viewers are going to light their hair on fire and say, who is this? Who is this guy saying that? But I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm more than happy to have the debate with anybody, anytime, anywhere. California is one of the worst places economically for Latinos to live. There's very little upward economic mobility. Our public schools are failing Latino children. The housing crisis disproportionately impacts Latinos. STEM, we don't have any less than 1% of our kids are qualified to work in the area that we are creating jobs, which are those STEM jobs and high-tech jobs. We're not educating the vast majority of our children to be occupied in those spaces, and they're Latino overwhelmingly. On and on and on and on and on. And all of these are fixable, by the way. These are all fixable policy problems, but they're not only are they not prioritized, it's the Democratic Party doesn't have the will to fix these things. They don't want to take on the orthodoxy or the unions. or the environmentalists in their own party, to say that we need to have a better economy for poor and working class people. That's what has always motivated me. That's why I became a Republican. People are shocked by that. How can you become a Republican? That's why I became a Republican.
Right.
It's why I look at the Republican Party and say, you guys don't deserve to be governing right now, but your ideas should be here to challenge the Democratic Party. And in many ways, that's what Antonio was saying.
Yeah.
Is this has failed Latino children. And so I saw a Latino Democrat, a prominent, saying the same thing I was saying to my party. And I'm like, I want to be with that guy. And here's why, about the diatribe. If there's one thing that could fix the country right now, and I know that's why you do this podcast, let me posit it is this. It's not attacking or challenging the other party. We're very good at that. It's challenging your own party. That's how you fix the brokenness. Because the more you double down on us being right no matter what, the deeper you dig the trench in the trench warfare of World War I. And all you're doing with that is making yourself more susceptible to the mustard gas shot from the other side. You have to, in a world where we cannot break the bubbles of the other side, our obligation as citizens, as Americans, as people who care about democracy, is to challenge the orthodoxy of your own party when it is not working.
Yeah.
That's what we did with the Lincoln Project, is fearlessly go out as somebody who cares more about your country and says, my party is doing this wrong. Because there's no way you can believe, unless you're just a completely unthinking person, 100% with your political party on all of its issues all of the time. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
And most Americans can't define three things where they disagree with their own party on, no matter how hypocritical they are, no matter how failed the policy is. It's just this identity we've allowed ourselves to dig into, where I define myself by how bad the opposition is, not how good my own views are or how superior or better my policy positions might be. I villainize you because I can't justify the failures of my own position.
So you know what's interesting? I had a guest on recently, and I was ambivalent about bringing her on, but it appeals to a certain, her message appeals to a certain number of folks who listen to the show. And it's basically, she had a book that basically beat Republicans at their own game. And she had this, she had this recipe for how to take any question and any talking point and turn it around and, mock the opponent and attack the opponent. And I was ambivalent about it because I don't, even though I think that there's an effectiveness to that, because of just sociologically and physiologically how our brains work, why that approach works, there's a huge part of me that's just against it. But to your point of what you're saying, that if you can, real change happens when it's a critique within. So over the last year, a couple of the more profound conversations I've had were with left of center activists, left of center leaders, left of center academic, like Yasha Monk, who I think Ron also had on Politicology. His critique in The Identity Trap was really a critique from within. He was engaging with other academics and giving them a fair shake in terms of what Ibram X. Kendi's argument actually was, and then engaging with it on a very erudite level and a fair level. That's why the critique was so penetrating. Or Greg Lukianoff with Fire. I forget the. But it's basically a free speech organization protecting free speech. Greg is a lifelong Democrat, lifelong left of center activist. But his critiques of cancel culture, even going back to his collaboration with Jonathan Haidt, those arguments and those critiques are much more effective than the fast food version of no CRT and CRT's the devil and wokeism. I'm the where wokeism goes to die kind of arguments. Those aren't going to go anywhere other than raise the heat on the culture wars. Whereas I've seen progress now made that like I said, what you're saying is the critiques from within are much more effective and have much more impact on just improving as a culture. So sorry, that was my version of the long.
Beautifully, well stated. I think those books and those voices, those social media voices that are, trying to teach you how to fight better and all this stuff, that is the junk food of democracy. That is killing democracy. And I'm going to tell you exactly why. The social contract of democracy requires compromise. It requires you to be wrong and to know how to be wrong, or to lose and not burn the house down.
Right.
Anybody teaching you to be right under any circumstances is P.T. Barnum. It's bullshit, but it is the toxicity on both sides of the aisle that is eroding the foundations of our democracy. And at a certain point, if you are becoming everything that you are working against, what do you win? Even if you win, you're becoming the enemy that you are trying to defeat. There's no victory in that.
Right.
So when you're talking about these intellectuals, and intellectuals don't engage in that, by the way, those are that's the performance politics of people who have insecurity issues and are trying to be popular on whatever platforms they're on and get likes. When you're talking to thoughtful people, anybody who believes that either party is inherently virtuous is a charlatan. That doesn't mean that at this moment in time there isn't one party that is quantifiably better than the other. I'm working against the Republican Party for that reason. There's no question. That's not debatable. But like I said, unless we're willing to have some level of introspection, we're not fixing anything. We're simply adding to the problem. And that's the difference between the Yasha monks of the world, those people and others who are simply engaged in the food fight for the sake of the food fight. You're not winning anything. And some people say, well, we have to win this election because it's blah, 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 blah. I would argue, yeah, it's true. I know how I'm voting. It will not be for Donald Trump. But the bigger question is, what are you winning? What are you winning if you're becoming that? You're not. You're doing as much damage as what you claim to be fighting against. And the big part of this is you're actually, by the way, there are no techniques to beat the other side or own the libs or attack the right and turn it on themselves. I mean, those are the snake oil salesmen of democracy. That is what damages the core, the undercarriage of the whole thing, because that's literally not the point. It's literally not the point of democracy. The point is to hear and understand and refute them. It's not to own them or to, not listen and try to demonstrate the superiority of your ideas and your party on 100% of things. That's literally the definition of a totalitarian state.
Yeah.
Democracy means you're wrong sometimes. Don't be wrong all the time. You can be right a majority of the time. But implicit in living in a democracy is the fact that you don't get what you want all the time. And being okay with that. You're saying, well, I think we should go here, but everybody else wants to go there. Doesn't mean I'm going to go, start an insurrection. Right? Doesn't mean I'm going to overthrow the election. It means, okay, this is what America is. It's a process that we agree on. And if we listen to people who are saying don't agree with them, or they're the enemy, and here's how you beat them at their own game, or this is, all that is doing is adding fuel to a fire that is already raging out of control.
Yeah. Yeah. What you're describing, it's one of the things that was so frustrating about recently the Senator Langford's bill that addressed what's happening on the border, immigration, that went nowhere. Because if you're a conservative, if you're a real conservative, that addressed about 80 to 90% of what conservatives would have wanted in a border and immigration bill. But because he had the temerity to be in the room with independent-minded Democrats, and to only have 80 or 90% as opposed to 100%, that was, in the Trump era, a cardinal sin. But I do want to start to wind it down. Toward the end of the book, I love you addressed 5 different states and gave 5 different case studies. So we don't need to necessarily go through all of them, but North Carolina, the chapter on North Carolina was particularly interesting to me. So I was hoping there's a growing Latino population, but a misunderstood one. So I was hoping you could describe the makeup of the North Carolina Latino population and why there's an opportunity for Democrats in the coming election.
North Carolina has always, kind of perplexed me like it has a lot of people, because on paper, it should be a state that is more Democrat than it currently is. And in fact, they regularly elect Democrats as governors.
Yeah.
Obama carried it in 2008. That was the last time. And the reason is because you have basically an even split between college educated whites and non-college educated whites, and then about 20% African American. And that alone should get you to a blue state position. The challenge in North Carolina is white college educated voters, more than in most other states, are voting like non-college educated whites. Not always, but enough. And their races are always very, very close. They're going to be decided by less than 100,000 votes, usually less than 50,000 votes. And what's interesting to me is Latinos will make up about 3, maybe 4% of the electorate this year, and they're never polled because that's too small of a subsample to get accurate polling results in. The pollsters just ignore it. It's in sort of this no man's land, but it's by far outside of the margin of error of what the vote is going to be. And most of this Latino population is recently migrated. It's first and second generation Latinos, which is a very, very, very strong Democratic constituency demographically. It's not like you're getting 44% Republican, 55% Democrat. It should be like 75% Democrat, 25% Republican, which is why I think, everyone's sweeping on North Carolina. And that's why I think that the Democrats have made a huge mistake. Is even for $1 million, you could have gone in there and registered another 40, 50, 80,000 Latinos, targeted them and turned them out, and probably won North Carolina. And they still may, but just tactically, the opportunity for North Carolina, and if Joe Biden could put that in the win column, completely changes the 270 map, completely changes the dynamics of this race. And so a year and a half ago, I was writing and saying this and raising my hand and saying, for very little money, you can change the entire map for the presidential campaign, right? Like the data guy from the Lincoln Project, the guy who was saying we could win Arizona, the guy who was saying we could win Georgia a year before everybody else was. I'm saying you could win North Carolina. Still possible, but I think they missed most of their window, and Biden's weaknesses are not consolidating. But North Carolina can and should be a blue state, and it would be. But I think Democrats and Republicans are so, and it makes sense because of East Coast and Southern provincialism, they view voters of non-white voters as black voters. And so they keep doubling down on black voters, which is great, but there's not that many more black voters to get.
Yeah.
There's far more Latino voters that are not engaged or on the voter rolls than African Americans that have been missed for the last 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, registration and election cycles. So that, and states like that, you got to keep looking at data differently than both parties do. It's amazing. It's like Moneyball. I mean,
Yeah.
these guys are still looking at, how attractive their girlfriends are and what the problem is with their swings to determine whether or not they're going to make it in the big leagues. It's like, it's not the way this is working, guys.
Man, that's one of the profound things that the Lincoln Project did, is that you weren't tethered to a party with its institutional structures and institutional thinking, that as a group, you were all saying, hey, guys, this is the answer. This is what the numbers are telling us. Is there anybody that you know of in the Biden campaign that's saying the unpopular thing in the room and saying, hey, I know we want to try to win Florida, but we really need to put our resources, a little bit more resources in North Carolina, as opposed to, dumping it into pretending that we're going to win Florida and Texas?
Well, I'm not going to say names, but I will say that Biden, they announced some changes kind of quietly about 5 or 6 weeks ago, which gave me some hope that they are changing out some of the old folks, especially on the Latino side, that just don't understand the Latino electorate at all. Same people that lost Hillary's race, the same people that lost the Latino vote by huge numbers in 2020.
Yeah.
So those I think they are making the right changes. David Binder doing the polling is phenomenal. Gave me a huge shot of confidence. I think David Binder is one of the best pollsters in America, far better than where they were. I hope he's overseeing the entire operation. I do believe that the fundamentals still benefit the Biden campaign, but I will also say they're running out of time, and time is now an issue. And a lot of what they have been trying to do has demonstrably not worked. And they're going to have to really upset some of the orthodoxy in their party if they're going to be successful. They've begun to do that on, Biden coming to the center on immigration
Mm-hmm.
and agreeing to Langford and others' policy. Let me say this real quickly. I know we're wrapping up, but that the border security policy that came out was not conservative. It was nativist. It's not even good policy. It's basically just shutting down the border. That may be what's required. It's not conservatism. And I get what you're saying. It's very, very Republican. And Biden said, fine, we'll have it. And the Republicans walk away from it basically because they're not interested in governing or solving the country's problems. But I think that the Biden was basically telling the Latino advocates and those professional Latino voices in his own party, you're wrong. We're going here. And the good news is that's where Latino voters are. That's what the American people are. And he has shown the strength to tell that calcified structure in the Democratic Party that they were wrong because they are. And that gives me hope.
That's kind of related to my next question. I think a great way to maybe three more questions. Sorry. Like I said, I could do this all day.
That's all right. No, let's go.
You said toward the beginning of the book, the truth is that I'm actually very optimistic about where we find ourselves as a country. Why in the hell are you?
What's so funny is when I tell people I wrote what I think is ultimately an optimistic book, people have to do a double take. It's like Mike Madrid wrote an optimistic book. Let me tell you why. And this is why, and I found this I didn't begin this way, but in looking at the data and making all of the arguments, there was this sudden realization, Corey, that we at this moment in American history, we are being governed and led by a generation of people that are amongst the wealthiest, most privileged people in the history of this 250-year-old republic. People who have lived in relative peace and enormous prosperity, and yet they have the most negative views of this country of any generation ever polled. And they are quickly being replaced by a younger, poorer, browner generation of Americans that don't have the money, they don't have the prestige, they don't have the social or political or financial capital of that older generation, but they are miles ahead in terms of their optimism and faith in America. And if you look at the demographic that has the highest degree of confidence in the media, in the government, in the military, in the church community, in every institution that is collapsing before our eyes, it is Latinos. And those are all institutions, whether you agree with them or not. And again, for some dysfunctional reasons, we partisanized our institutions in this culture. But it is Latinos that have the trust and confidence in those institutions that are required to make democracy work. And this book is the first time anybody, I think, is really positing anything positive about American democracy in the last 10 years. But the reason why is this: everybody is focused on process, electoral college reform, campaign finance reform. You talked about people saying how to fight better, how do you win that policy? How do we beat at the lawfare game? And what I'm arguing is the seeds of the success of American democracy and the American experiment are literally inside of us. It is looking inside of our own DNA, and what is emerging is a more positive, aspirational, pluralistic, confident notion of what America, the American idea is, and the ability to get to what the founders ultimately set out as our aspirational goal. And that is happening. And every day that we wake up, there are 10,000 new Latinos turning 18. And unfortunately, or at least for maybe American democracy, fortunately, 7,500 people are moving on to the next life. And their voting patterns are reflecting a change in their belief in America. And I think I'm the first person who's making a cultural argument that is positive about where we are heading based off of demography and data as I see it. And then everyone else is a little bit more focused on process.
Yeah.
As my good friend George Conway says, there is no constitution that can be written strong enough to protect itself from a people that do not want it. And what we have is the fastest growing segment of the electorate are a people that want it and love it and have faith in it and trust it. And so every day you wake up in America is a day that we are closer to having that being a bigger part of our community, our society, and our electorate than the day before. And that's inherently optimistic.
Oh man, I love it. I'd love to get George Conway on this program, but we can talk about that when I come up to visit you in Sacramento in about a week.
Yeah.
Couple, my TP&R question. You've answered this before, but I'd love to hear your thoughts if they've evolved at all. The TP&R question is: what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, and perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So people who have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
I'm going to say lead with criticisms of your own party when you're engaging with those folks. Say, I'm a Republican, but I disagree with this policy. What's one policy you disagree with your party on? And if you get a genuine answer, you've got a hell of a lot to work with.
Yeah.
If you don't, you've got somebody who has no interest in being constructive anyway. And that's your job. I don't think your job is not to change that. Or there's really not much you can do to change somebody who doesn't want to change. Somebody who's looking to be destructive, you can't engage that person at a citizen level. But when you acknowledge that you are not a purely partisan warrior, that you are somebody who's genuinely interested in being constructive and is true to the idea of democracy, which is I don't get everything that I want, and more so that I'm willing to criticize people from my own tribe, that buys you a lot. And if you could lead with that and then ask them if there's one thing that you think your party is, that you disagree with your party on, what is that? And when you both verbalize that, it's something to work with.
Yeah, have something to work with. Yeah, and listen, guys like you, guys like Pete Wehner, guys like George Conway have been doing that for the better part of the last 8-9 years. At different points, you became more vocal and more leadership, and it made you basically politically homeless. It cost you your political home, and arguably your careers that you had to then rebuild. Which is why I have so much respect for some of the voices like yours and Ron's and so many others that really did take that risk and step out there to criticize their lifelong party. But now, now folks like us are. Should we criticize the politically homeless? I mean, that's the only quandary now.
Well, let me say this. I think the goal should be for every participant in American democracy to be politically homeless. That should be the goal. If you're finding too much comfort in a political party, you're doing this whole thing wrong. You're doing it wrong. You should not. They need to be chasing you. When you turn over your fealty to a party, you lose your voice.
Oh man, yeah. You start dressing a certain way in a blue suit and a red tie, and
red tie. You shame yourself.
Yeah,
have some self-respect.
Seriously.
And that's ultimately that's what the parties are demanding of us, and I reject that. I refuse that. And certainly it's more in the Republican Party, but I'm also going to say it's a big part of the Democratic Party too. Sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I actually, to your point about criticizing your own party, I appreciate that these they're after 2020 when George Floyd was killed, there's certain universities that were asking for DEI statements from applicants. And that trend is now being reversed. Not that we shouldn't work hard towards the principles, the ideals of more diversity and inclusion, but it was as if you had to utter certain language and certain words and certain phrases in order to get your cool card or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, do you have any questions for me?
I'm going to ask you the same question that I've asked you from the beginning. I'm going to continue to ask you every time you'll have me on. Are you glad you started this journey, and would you do it again? Starting the podcast and starting this discussion, and what have you learned?
Oh man, so absolutely, absolutely, and I've learned a ton. So I'm so glad that I started this journey. I'm so glad that I would do it all over again. There's plenty that I would do differently. I've learned so much, especially on this program. But you have to be able to make mistakes in order to learn from those mistakes. I learn a lot more from my L's than I do from my W's. So that I think that's just part of the journey. I would absolutely do it all over again. Maybe if there is something I would have done differently, is I would have started even earlier. I would have started in 2016 if I could. So what have I learned? I've learned a lot. Part of it is more, it's not even about the content that we talk about so much as the people that we talk with. I've learned that people at the highest levels of their fields are approachable and accessible if you approach it in a relational way. That if you have a question about something that they've worked on, a piece that they've written, a campaign that they've worked on, a shared interest, if it's conversational leading towards something, the possibility of relational, and that's the context within which you're having a conversation, it's really, really fruitful. So I've been blown away again and again. And there's something in me when guys like you respond to me, be like, the first time I reached out and you said, "Oh yeah, that sounds like fun. Let's hop on." I was like, "Really, dude?" You don't know me. I'm like a nobody, but so many people have said that, that I've been amazed, just in the recent months, having a guy like David Brooks, whose books and his pieces have
Brilliant,
literally
man.
changed my life,
Yeah.
And there's
and
so
of course the direction of the country.
His sociological observations are just irreplaceable. Are Nancy French, whose investigative work as a guy who's been in part of the Christian church now for almost 25 years, her investigative journalism is so important, such a contribution, not just to our country, but to the church, to American Christianity. To be able to talk to Nancy while she's battling stage 4 cancer, or Lieutenant Colonel Vindman having he insists on me calling him Alex, on the show. That is so freaking cool. And it's about people. It's about people. It's about the approachability and their humanity, and that they all have a story and all of this story, all of their stories add to the larger American story, the larger American project that we're in the middle of. So yeah, man, I guess for those reasons, like you, I'm optimistic. I have reason to be hopeful for where we're going as a country. But as you also point out in the book, that it's through turmoil, it's through challenges, it's through the tests that we find our character and come out the other side. So we
need to be worthy of the moment. That, to me, that's more than any other reason. Is we should be grateful for the struggle of this time. This is how national character is built. Of course, we're going to come through this, but we're going to have to fight for it and struggle for it. Like, we're just this generation that believed all the platitudes and never thought that the words were real. They're real. Every generation has to fight for American democracy to hand it to the next generation. This is our fight. And let's be worthy of it. Let's be worthy of the moment, because the more we fight, the more we engage, the more we stand up, the more virtuous we are, the more we define what America is going to be for our children. They see that. They learn that. That's the way they take democracy to the next generation. And that's how they take it to the fight and the challenges that they're going to face, because they are going to face them.
I love it. I love it. Mike, it's always such a pleasure, man. So before we go, how can folks follow you, find more information about the Latino Century, how America's largest minority is transforming democracy? When's it actually officially coming out? And follow, we just want to follow all the great work you're doing.
Follow me on Twitter or X at Madrid_Mike. Go to Amazon and just put in Mike Madrid, the Latino Century. It's coming out June 18th, but pre-sales and pre-orders really help. I'd appreciate that. It moves us up in the rankings, as it were. And it's going to help this discussion move forward. That's the why you write a book, is to start being part of the national discourse. And I think you'll enjoy it. I hope you'll enjoy it. Mike Madrid, the Latino Century. Simon & Schuster, pick it up at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere you get your books. pre-order before June 18th, and you'll have it ready and waiting for you on that day in your mailbox.
So I'll definitely put those links in the show notes, your Twitter link and the link to the book on Amazon. And Mike, it's always so cool to be able to spend time with you. I'm going to see you in about a week. I'm coming up for that event on the book event. So that'll be fun to see you and Ron. Thanks so much for doing this, man.
All right, guys. Take care. Thanks for having me.
You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow this show and write that review. Tell a friend about talking politics and religion without killing each other. We are easier to recommend than ever. Just tell your friends to go to their favorite podcast app and type in "without killing" and the G. There's no G in the killing. Without killing, and our big purple logo will show up. Or you can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey with an E and S as in Scott. Nathan at Corey S. Nathan. Now, go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.